In this video, we're going to talk about how to solve polynomial equations using the zero product property. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to solve polynomials using the zero product property. The zero product property says that if the product of two numbers is zero, then at least one of the numbers or one of the factors must be zero. So when we're solving polynomial equations, the first thing that we're going to do is we need to factor them. So in order to factor a polynomial, remember that we find the greatest common factor amongst the coefficients and amongst the variables, and then we factor by grouping if there's four terms. Once we have the GCF, then we factor out that GCF from both terms. Remember that we use the operation of division to factor it out. Once we have factored it, once we've completely factored the polynomial, then what we do is we set each of the factors equal to 0. So we'll have two factors, they'll both be equal to 0. We'll solve for the variable, and then we should end up with two different answers, and then we'll check both answers that are in that solution set to make sure that they work for the problem. So let's look at the following. So solve and then check the solution. So here we have a polynomial that's already factored. So I don't have to go about the work of factoring this one. But remember, the next step after factoring is to set each of the factors equal to 0. So my two factors are d minus 5 and 2d plus 4. So I'm going to set d minus 5 equal to 0. I'm going to set 2d plus 4 equal to 0. And then I'm going to solve. So I'm going to solve for the variable in each of these two equations now. So I'm going to solve for the variable here. Add 5. We'll get d is equal to 5. On this one, we would subtract 4 on both sides. We get 2d is equal to 4, or negative 4. Divide by 2. And d is equal to negative 2. So in our solution, we have negative 2 and 5. And so when we're representing our solution, we write it as in set notation. So in braces, we'll write it in ascending order, so from least to greatest. And it'll be negative 2, 5. Okay, so we want to check this. We want to make sure that our solution is actually the correct solution. So when I'm checking, I'll plug back in, I'll substitute back in negative 2 into the equation. And then we'll see if this works. So instead of d, we'll put negative 2. And the product of these two should equal 0. So this is negative 7. 2 times negative 2 is negative 4. And negative 4 plus 4 is 0. And I know that negative 7 times 0 is 0. So we know this equation is, or we know negative 2 works. And then we'll do the same thing for 5. 5 minus 5. Instead of d minus 5, we'll do 5 minus 5. And then we had 5, 2 times 5 plus 4. Well, I know that 5 plus 5 is 0, or 5 minus 5 is 0. And it doesn't really matter what I get in this one, because anything times 0 will give me 0. So the 5 also works for this equation. Okay. So if we apply the same thing to this next problem, again, we're looking at x plus 3 and x plus 5. This is already factored, so I don't have to factor this part. But I am going to set each of the factors equal to 0. So we have x plus 3 is equal to 0. We'll have x plus 5 is equal to 0. And we'll solve for x in both. So I would subtract 3 on this one, and so that would give me x is equal to 3. We would subtract 5 on this one, that would give me x is equal to negative 5. And so my solution would be negative 5 and negative 3. And braces. Again, remember that you want to check the solution. So if I plug in negative 5 into both of the binomials, as long as one of these factors is 0, we're good. So in this case it is. We do the same thing for negative 3. Negative 3 plus 3 is 0, so I don't really even need to check this one. But we do know that 0 times 2 is equal to 0 as well. So both of our answers work as a solution. when it's not already factored, so let's say that we have the equation x squared equals 7x. In order to solve this one, remember that the first step is to factor. Before I can factor this equation, I have to have everything on the same side. So let's move the 7x. So let's subtract 7x on both sides so that we can factor this. So when I subtract 7x on both sides, my new equation is going to look like x squared minus 7x is equal to 0, because everything is now off of this side. Okay? Now we'll factor. Okay, so we look for the greatest common factor that we can pull out of both terms. So we can pull out an x from x squared and from negative 7x. So when we factor out the x, we're left with x and minus 7 is equal to 0. So there's our two factors. Now, once we have our factors, we want to set them equal to 0. So we'll set our first factor, which is x equal to 0, our second factor, which is x minus 7 equal to 0, and solve. Well, I already know that x is going to be 0, and if I add 7 on both sides, we'll have x is equal to 7. So our solution here would be 0 and 7. Again, you want to check your answer. So if we substitute in 0 for x, 0 squared is equal to 7 times 0. And we know that that's true. 0 squared is 0. 7 times 0 is 0. We get the same thing on both sides. Do the same thing with 7. So 7 squared and 7 times 7. And we know that 7 times 7 is 49. 7 squared is 49. So we know that that one is also correct. Okay. We can factor by grouping. So if we're looking at this one, okay, we've got 4 terms here. In order to solve this, remember that we first have to factor. So we would factor by grouping. Remember that when we factor by grouping, we group terms that are alike together. So I know that 6c and 12c have common factors. 2 and 4c have common factors. What I can factor out of this first group is a 6c. Both of them, the GCF between the coefficients is 6. The greatest common factor amongst the variables is c. When I factor out a 6c, I'm left with 1 and minus 2c. I can factor out a 2 from the second group. When I factor out the 2, we're left with 1 minus 2c. Now, remember that when we're factoring by grouping, this is not how we leave our final answer. So we change it into the form so that the 2 outside factors get put back together. And our other binomial gets brought down. So our 2 factors are 6c plus 2 is and 1c, 1 minus 2c. So we say each of those factors equals to 0. Alright, and we're solving here. I subtract 2, so that would be 6c is equal to negative 2. Divide by 6 on both sides, that would be negative 2 over 6, which simplifies to negative 1/3. Again, do the same thing here, subtract 1 on both sides, so that gives me negative 2c equals negative 1. Divide by negative 2, that gives me negative 1 over negative 2. And negative 1 over 2 is the same thing as positive 1. So our solution for this one would be negative 1/3 and positive 1/2. Now, there are times where we have to look at real-world applications such as geometric problems. So here, we want to write an expression in factor form for the area of the shaded region. So we're looking at the area of the square and taking away the area of the circle to get the shaded region. Well, to get the area of the square, I need to know what the side lengths of the square are. Because I know the radius is the same as half of the length, if I double the radius, that will give me the length of the entire square. So, my side lengths of my square are 2r. So if I do 2r times 2r, or 2r squared, that would give me 4r squared for my area of my square. Now, we know the area of a circle is pi r squared. So pi times radius squared. This would be my polynomial, but it does want it in factor form, so I have to look at what can we factor out of both terms. And both terms contain an r squared, so we can factor out an r squared from both. So when I factor out r squared, the first term I'm left with 4, and then the second term we're left with pi. So the factored form would be 4 minus pi. When we're looking at real-world applications, such as for polynomials, a lot of them have to do with vertical motion. So we have a rocket. The rocket is shot up in the air at 32 feet per second. The formula used to measure the height is given. How long is the rocket in the air before falling back to the ground? We know that h stands for the height and t stands for time. We're looking at the height when it's at the ground. So the height at the ground would be 0. So we're going to make h 0. And then now that we have one variable that we know, and we're only missing one now, we can solve this equation. So we solve it, remember, by factoring first. So I would factor the polynomial, look for the greatest common factor. 16 is the GCF amongst the coefficients. T is the GCF amongst the variables. And when I factor that out, I get 2 minus t. So we have 16t times 2 minus t is equal to 0. Set each of your factors equal to 0. So 16t equals 0. 2 minus t equals 0. So I know that t is going to be equal to 0 on the first one. If I add t on both sides, then I get t is equal to 2. And so I know that my rocket started on the ground at 0 seconds, went up in the air, and came back down to the ground after 2 seconds. So the rocket was in the air for 2 seconds before falling back to the ground. This is how we solve polynomial equations using zero product property.